But one of the things that I always kind of like was butting my head against as a kid that is eventually why I kind of left the classical community like altogether, is just because I always kind of felt like the narrower I got, the more I was celebrated. And I feel really lucky that like in this other alternative life that I have been living and that I am living, it's like the more breadth I experience, the deeper I feel, and the more connected I feel. So I feel lucky that that's the deal these days.
Hi, you're listening to Conversations with Musicians with Leah Roseman, which I hope inspires you through the personal stories of a fascinating diversity of musical guests. Carolyn Kendrick is a fiddler, songwriter, and producer based in California. I'm really looking forward to her upcoming podcast with Tristan Scroggins, Don't Call Me Darlin, based on an archive of women in bluegrass newsletters. You'll also be fascinated to learn about Carolyn's project, Each Machine, and you'll be hearing some of that music, and about her research into the Satanic Panic. She also started a really cool initiative with her friend Isa Burke, the Gender Equity Audio Workshop. You'll hear Carolyn's tips on songwriting, how she remembers songs, and how she's built a balanced life in music. You can watch the video on my YouTube or listen to the podcast, and I've also linked the transcript. It's a joy to bring these inspiring episodes to you, and I do all the many jobs of research, production, and publicity. Have a look at the show notes of this episode on my website, where you'll find all the links, including different ways to support this podcast and other episodes you'll enjoy. Hey, Carolyn, thanks so much for joining me here today.
Hello, lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I thought it might be really interesting to start with your new podcast project with Tristan Scroggins. Mm-hmm. When do you have a release date for that?
Yeah, we're the release date currently right now, the plan is that it will be coming out in June of this year, though I will say that like sometimes things happen and it might get pushed back a little bit, but that is the expected time right now. It's been a really fun project to work on, especially with Tristan, and it's pretty extensive and cool, and it's gonna be really fun.
Yeah, so listeners of this podcast might remember my episode with Alyssa Rose, and she has a duo with Tristan Scroggins. So we featured their music on that podcast, so I'll link that up.
Great.
So Don't Call Me Darlin. Fascinating to learn about this history. Why don't you just dive in and tell us about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So our friend Tristan Scroggins, he came into having a collection of this physical newsletter that was distributed kind of zine style in the 90s that was made by this banjo player named Murphy Henry. She lives in Virginia. She's originally from Georgia. And this was basically an underground feminist newsletter that was meant for women who played bluegrass. It was called Women in Bluegrass. And the purpose of the newsletter was essentially to display and showcase to all bluegrass fans and all music fans generally in the bluegrass community in general that there are a ton of women who play bluegrass, because at that point in time it was like very, very rare for women to be getting hired in professional capacities in the bluegrass scene, and there certainly has been a lot of strides made, but we're far from parity at this point. But at this point in the 90s when it was being made, Murphy wanted to display that, like she would constantly have these conversations where men would be like, well, I'd love to hire a woman, but I just don't know any who play. And so she basically created this database and this newsletter. And she said, well, if you ever say you can't find somebody, like a woman to play fiddle or dobro or whatever, here's a list of everybody that I know. And it's, thousands of women. And in the newsletter, there's, lots of articles about not just gender parity, but figuring out how to, work on like the difficulties of being in a male-dominated industry, and also community support, also, changes in life support. So, for example, if somebody was going through, a sickness or a family death or something, there would be like a bulletin about that, so that people could send in their well wishes and flowers and, drop off soup and things like that. And so this newsletter, Tristan got like a complete copy of it, and it ran for about 10 years. And he was showing it to me, and I was like, this is really incredible stuff. I really love how this is, not just exactly up my alley because I am a fiddle player, but also because like I grew up around a lot of women who were really influenced by like the Riot Girl era of music, and like I grew up in a DIY hardcore punk scene as well, which is very zine focused and very community and mutual aid focused as well. And people don't tend to think of progressive politics and bluegrass together very often. And so Tristan and I decided we wanted to make an archive out of this newsletter. And then as a way to promote the archive, we were like, let's make a show about it and go back and interview these women and see if they agree with their former selves or their younger selves, what they think now, what's changed, what's better, what's different, what's the same, all of that.
Wonderful. So I've signed up for the podcast, so when it comes out, I'll be notified. So we'll have that link in the show notes.
Love
you
that.
guys have put out a great trailer. Could we maybe, do you want to include that as part of this episode?
That would be great. I would love that.
Do you remember life before the internet? I barely remember.
On Wednesday, the White House announced its plan to make America the world leader in artificial intelligence.
Seen as part of the manosphere, social media stars appealing
American
to
teens
grow.
now average nearly 5 hours per
Correlation
day on
between social media use and high rates of anxiety and depression in teenagers.
21st century life is so digitally saturated that it's very easy to yearn for a more unplugged time. Which is probably why I went deep down this rabbit hole when my friend Tristan Scroggins showed me something amazingly unplugged. A stack of physical, underground, feminist music newsletters from the 1990s. These newsletters were made without computers, without AI, without social media. And they were made for women, by women. Women who played bluegrass.
Bluegrass music.
Bluegrass for sure.
Bluegrass bands.
For women in bluegrass.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Kendrick, and this is my co-producer Tristan Scroggins.
Hi. Wait, I never know the cadence to say hi. Hi. Like an alien blowing its own cover.
Welcome to Don't Call Me Darlin. In 1994, a Virginia banjo player named Murphy Hicks Henry was fed up.
My name is Murphy Hicks Henry, writer first, and then maybe banjo player second. Feminist, baby boomer from the South.
Now, you might be surprised to hear feminism and bluegrass in the same breath, considering the genre's reputation as a more rural, conservative folk music from the American South. When most folks hear underground feminists, they tend to think of movements like Riot Girl, or mid-century housewives passing around copies of the feminine mystique.
Women are apparently liberated in many ways, but in fact and in practice, they're not. They're still discriminated against in many professional fields.
But there might be more of a connection between these worlds than meets the eye.
I don't know what they thought, but I mean, I've been called the Jane Fonda of bluegrass.
Up until recently, it was almost impossible to get a job in an existing bluegrass band as a woman, unless you were married to or related to a band member, or just started an all-girl band. So Murphy created this physical newsletter to change that, and called it Women in Bluegrass.
Every time that I was pregnant with one of my kids, people would come up to me and say, "Oh, I guess you're going to quit playing." Like, no, I'm not quitting playing. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
These newsletters were distributed for almost a decade and to thousands of readers, and the interviews and articles reflected the very real struggles of playing in a male-dominated music.
I just think of how many times somebody would come up to me at a festival and he'd be like, "Hey, I got a new band. I need a mandolin player. Do you know anybody?" I'd be like, "Hey, me." Yeah. Oh, our wives would never put up with that.
Women in Bluegrass discussed privately what was still considered taboo in public.
What you have to realize, and what's kind of impossible to realize if you weren't there, is what it was like in 1994 to have AIDS.
When Tristan and I started reading through this catalog, we couldn't help but wonder, what did these women think now? Do they still agree with their younger selves? And what do younger generations of women playing this music now think of its influence? So we decided to go ask.
I feel like the young women in bluegrass do not really get it, how hard it was for us. They can't. They haven't had that experience.
For as hard as it is to remember life before the internet, it's even harder to understand experiences of earlier generations. The more distanced we are from our elders' experiences, the easier it is to unfairly romanticize the past without learning its lessons. So join us for our 8-part road trip as we explore the paradoxical world of bluegrass, an American art form with American problems, strengths, and growing pains. And no matter if you live and breathe bluegrass or can't stand the sight of a banjo, this story has something for you. Thanks for being here. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Episode 1 will be here before you know it. See you soon.
And I said, I want to play like her.
Yeah, it just had me thinking, I should have it to show you. From my mom, I inherited, I think it's like the first edition of Ms. Magazine from 1970, maybe. I forget the exact year. Yeah, just when I would have been a baby. And it's amazing to have these physical archives, you know.
Yes.
It's something different to hold in your hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, a lot of this project has really been about, you know, kind of contending with how digitized everything in our lives are, including like the music that we make. And, you know, like I have the physical archive on my bookshelf, and I often, you know, thumb through it, and I just absolutely adore physical media. And I especially think it's important to have a relationship with music in the physical realm as well. And so it's kind of a cool combo of all those things. And Ms. Magazine is awesome. I've read some really cool articles from that publication.
When I interviewed Brittany Haas for this podcast a couple of years ago, we talked about women in bluegrass a little bit, and she said there can be like a lot of testosterone in the room, just in terms of like taking solos in a jam session, this sort of thing, and you kind of have to push back. I mean, you have your foot in different styles, but in that scene, have you found that?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I'm like I play bluegrass almost like all the time, like in like a weekly setting, I would say. There's at least like 2 or 3 days a week where I'm like in pretty heavy bluegrass, you know, jams or gigs or whatever. And I'm almost always the only woman in the band, if not, like maybe there might be one other woman, maybe if I'm lucky, but usually it's just me. And that's still pretty common, like across bluegrass in general, you know, like there's definitely a lot more female band leaders, and there's always been, you know, like all girl groups, and, you know, we've obviously got the Delamays and the Good Old Persons, and, you know, all these mixed gender bands, but it's still kind of rare to have more. It's less common than you would think in bluegrass to have like more than one woman on the bandstand.
And in terms of the pipeline, like, I know you went to Berklee, but I'm curious, did you do like fiddle camps when you were younger in terms of like the gender divide?
Yeah, I didn't. I had a little bit of an untraditional path to get into fiddling compared to many of my other cohort. I have musician parents. My dad is a jazz drummer, and my mom is a French horn player and composer and a music educator. And so growing up, I played drums and I played classical violin through Suzuki, and I sang a lot. And when I got into high school, I just started playing with bands, like any bands that I could get into, kind of agnostic of genre, because I really was just like, kind of the most important thing to me in playing music is playing with other people. And so it took me a long time to figure out what kind of genre and world and realm that I really like felt emotionally and musically connected to in a bigger way, other than just like, I just love music. But when I was 17, I did go to Mark O'Connor's camp, but it was at Berklee. And that was because I was looking at Berklee as a school to go to. And so yeah, it really wasn't until I got to Berklee that I learned about like fiddle as a world, or learned about fiddle camps more extensively. And yeah, it was maybe like 1920 before I fully got into bluegrass.
Well, let's, like, when you first contacted me, actually, was over a year ago, and your Each Machine album had come out. So I've listened to this a lot. I read your zine. Thanks so much for sending it to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am curious, have you considered publishing it in different formats, or putting it on Substack or some kind of other physical?
I have. Yeah, there's all kinds of ideas that I've had about what to do with it. But ultimately, like, I always end up coming up against, the dreaded calendar and the amount of hours in the day. But I have thought about, like, maybe publishing it through some, publication, or just putting it on Substack or something like that. I've also thought about maybe making it into, like, video essays of some kind. And I do think that, I think I eventually will probably have a copy of it up on my website or something like that. But, I really felt like making that zine and making Each Machine was such a catharsis for a very particular time of my life. And it was like a way to process this big project that I had been part of. And a little bit of me is like, once I got it out into the world, I was like, I'm ready for that chapter to be, what it was. And I don't necessarily need to, like, be revisiting it with regularity. But I am very fond of all of the essays and the music.
Yeah, if I could just suggest, because you do provide it for people if they buy a physical copy of the CD. Mm. But although I'm a fan of physical media, a lot of us have too much stuff in our small places of residence. Mm-hmm. If you could just sell, like, a PDF on your Bandcamp for a small amount, then more people could read it. Because that's true. Yeah, it's a beautiful document. So let's dive into the project. I have to say, in terms of the music, the last track on the album, A Perfect World, with poetry by David Keig, it's really beautiful. Do you want to maybe start with that? And we could play a clip for people?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came across this poem online. I'm like a big poetry head. I probably read poetry most days, but I came across this poem kind of on accident because I was looking through historical documents of historic poems about the devil. And then I just happened to come across this modern poem. And David, I believe, lives in New Zealand or maybe Australia. I'm not sure. He might have moved since we last spoke. And I was just immediately struck by it, and it felt like it was like the thesis of what I had been thinking about in the process of making the music, which was that we're all fallible, and any fault that we see in others, it's our responsibility to hold ourselves accountable and responsible as well, for our own bullshit. And I also I probably wrote the song like in 10 minutes. Like, it just felt like such a natural extension of the poem, and it was very easy to come together, and I really love that song. Yeah.
I dreamt I saw a perfect world I did see, but it could not be perfect, as it included me,
So did you send it to him right away? How did that work?
I did. I sent it to him, and we asked for permission, and figured out how to do all the rights and stuff like that. Yeah, okay. And he was very, very gracious to be down to let me release it.
So, in terms of how you got to be researching all these things related to Satanism, the pandemic hit. Your life took a big turn. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, I had been a professional musician and, touring in my own projects and as a side person for forever. And then, COVID hit, and I, not completely randomly, but a little bit randomly, was living in rural Maine, which was supposed to only be like a very short term, like couple month thing, like as a break, and then turned into more of like an extended, year and a half situation because of COVID. And because of that, the combo of that, and then also just where I was at in life and needing a little bit of a, scene change. And I think it's pretty common for most musicians to go through a period of time where they're like, well, how do I want to interface with music? Do I have to have this be a money-making endeavor, or do I want this to be, just social, or do I want to be in this industry? I was kind of asking all of those questions. And as a way to kind of like buffer myself and like not have so much pressure on all of my music all of the time, I decided to take a job as a podcast producer. And then through that, I ended up working on these, various other shows. And then, I just got hired as a researcher and a producer on a docuseries about Satan. So, yeah.
Well, I'm old enough that I remember the Satanic Panic and all the stuff in the news, in the 1980s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And so I did kind of do some Googling when I was listening to the album and reading the zine and remembering some of this stuff. And it's pretty shocking. So just that term Satanic Panic in these relatively recent times, do you want to talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, well, so the Satanic Panic, as many people culturally remember it, is, often people remember like the Tipper Gore hearings, or people freaking out about their, when you listen to like heavy metal or rock records, there being like satanic sentiments if you listen to records backwards or things like that. But on a deeper level, there's this kind of cultural shift that came up with the rise of evangelism and Reaganism. And I think as women were moving into the workforce, there was kind of just this flurry of all of these different cultural anxieties about, well, who's going to take care of the children if the women are working, and if, there's people are generally were concerned about that, which I generally have a lot of sympathy for and empathy for. But the way that ended up culturally getting expressed was a lot of innocent people being accused of abusing children or sacrificing children in the name of Satan, often with almost no evidence or like very bad evidence. And usually it was just like there was, something that was suspicious, and then it like snowballed into this just big, massive panic. And the idea is not that this is like an isolated incident. It's that these types of panics have happened across time and space and culture. And, like the Salem witch trials is another example of a moral panic. The blood libel panic is also another example of that. And so, we're kind of prone to panic in our culture. And this was just one particular way that it ended up manifesting.
Yeah, and of course we're not talking about the horrible reality of child abuse. That's separate.
Right.
These were fabricated, weird satanic rituals connected with childcare, like daycare.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Like I think the most famous case was in California, and it's like the most expensive case that has happened in like California judicial history. I might have that slightly off, but like something along those lines. And then absolutely like zero evidence was found at the end of all of it.
Yeah. So processing all this, doing all this research, and you came up with this album of both original and traditional songs. Mm-hmm. And also it's not just songs, it's like a sort of an audio documentary almost as you listen through. Mm-hmm. Maybe we could play, I was thinking, like you have some 1970s feminist protests, this track Sugar and Spice in there. Maybe just play a short clip of that.
Nails and puppy dog tails. That's what little boys are made of. Sugar and spice and everything nice. That's what little girls are.
Meaning every boy in this society is raised to be something, to be a doctor, to be a lawyer, to be something. Not every.
So as part of your research, what kind of people did you interview?
A lot of the folks that I was interviewing were, like cult survivors. I was interviewing people who are actually Satanists, which is the people who participate in either the Satanic Temple or the Church of Satan. It's very different than like the cultural imagination of Satanists in the 1980s. Like it's a much more modern and sort of contrarian free speech movement rather than what people tend to think of it as. And I was also, like interviewing some folks who had been wrongly accused. I was also interviewing some folks who had backgrounds on other types of moral panics that had happened, people who had context for like the Salem witch trials and the political context around that. And it's so funny thinking about all of this, especially since I've been, kind of removed from the project a little while. Like, I will never get tired of how funny it is that it's like I, am like a fiddle player who loves fiddle tunes, and then I just like, I'm like casually in a situation where I'm like interviewing, Jim Jones's son, it's just like the world is wild, and you end up in these like very interesting places if you open the door and go through it.
Jim Jones's son, tell us about that interview.
It was really lovely. Stephan is really just, he's done a really remarkable job of being like a bastion of like reason and self-reflection. And I think it's one of those things where like if you've experienced such a deep horror such as Jonestown, and he was not there when it happened, he was out of town for a basketball tournament, but I think he's spent most of his life dedicated to being somebody who is pretty level-headed and loving and reasonable, I think, as like a direct counterweight to his dad's energy.
Yeah, maybe it would be interesting for you to suggest one other track we could play a clip of from this album.
Well, I think my personal favorite is Leela, though I think a lot of people really enjoy the Devil's Nine Questions. But I love Leela because it's, I think people, this record is about me processing my feelings about being involved in this project about Satan, right? And so but I am myself not religious. In fact, I'm actively like a-religious in many ways. And like I do not believe in a literal Satan. I don't believe in a literal devil, and I also don't believe in a literal God. But I am like a very, very deeply humanist person, and I love the song Leela because it feels like that's actually kind of more of a reflection of what my worldview is as opposed to what the project's worldview was.
Yeah, and another thing came up when I was researching this, I remember, was the function of murder ballads.
I pulled a lot of the trad songs that I picked from this from Jody Stecker's music. He's definitely one of my favorite folk artists of all time. And one of the only murder ballads that I play and will play is Wind and Rain, which is on this record. Mm-hmm. And I think that, if we're considering like the ways in which society implements violence against itself and its own, then I think murder ballads are a really interesting allegory and metaphor for how cultural violence is transmitted culturally, for better and for worse, both as a warning and as information that women spread to each other. And yeah.
There were two sisters came walking down the stream. Oh, the wind and rain. One came behind and pushed the other one in, crying, oh, the dreadful wind and rain. Johnny gave the younger one a gay gold ring. Oh, the wind and rain. Didn't give the other one anything, crying, oh, the dreadful wind and rain.
Okay, now you do have an upcoming album later this year.
Yes,
and
I do.
I was privileged to listen to a preview. Thanks for sharing those tracks. But I understand you'll start releasing singles in the summer, maybe?
Yeah, it seems, the plan is that we'll finish up releasing Don't Call Me Darlin, and then after that, then I'll start releasing the record.
Yeah. So are you going to be having a tour associated with this release?
I hope so. Yeah, I imagine that it will be mostly a West Coast based situation. I'm kind of sticking over here these days, but yeah, I'm very much looking forward to playing a lot of shows for this record. And it's such a different tone.
Yeah.
It's much more lighthearted, I would say.
Yeah. So actually, on each machine, I meant to ask about Isa Burke, if I pronounced her name correctly. So she's a close friend who worked on you with that album. Is she involved in the new one?
No, she wasn't, which I was sad about. We were hoping to be able to match up our timelines, but yeah, Isa's definitely one of my best friends, if not a best friend. And we met our first week of Berklee together, and we've stayed very good friends and collaborate on a lot of different projects, including music. And then also we run a program called the Gender Equity Audio Workshop together. And that, provides studio time for women who want to learn how to produce and mix and work in a studio.
Yeah, I remember seeing that project. So how many iterations have there been of that?
We've done 2, and we're in the process of scheduling planning our 3rd.
Okay. Has anything surprised you about the people who attended, or anything about it?
I mean, mostly I've been surprised by what a great reception we've got to it. And it's one of those things where Isa and I are doing it for free. We're not getting paid. We're just doing it as a community effort, but we're trying to figure out how to build it out so that there can be more infrastructure so that we can do more, because we were overwhelmed with applications from people all over the world. And I think that's mostly what surprised me, was how much people really are gravitating towards it, although it's really cool. So, but mostly I think it's just that women are so underrepresented in studio spaces, both as side musicians and musicians generally, but also on the engineering side, that it's just really hard to go into a studio space and feel at ease with trying to figure out how to work the gear and things like that. And there's just such a hunger. Every single one of the people that has come to the program has just been brilliant and really, really, just down to get their hands dirty, which I love.
And you're doing this virtually?
No, it's in person.
Yeah.
So, Yeah. So the 2 that we've hosted thus far have been in a studio called Great North Sound Society in Maine. And yeah, we book out the studio for 3 days, and then it's a very small program. We can, really only fit, I think we had 8 participants last time. And then, we just talk about all of the gear, we record, we practice, and everybody gets an opportunity to work both behind the board and in front of a microphone and learn about all the gear.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. The reason I asked about it being in person was simply, or online, because you said people from all over the world. So people were willing to travel.
Yeah, people were definitely willing to travel. Like, we had some folks apply from like Australia and the UK. Wow. And we weren't even like advertising. I think people just found out through Instagram or whatever. So yeah, we're hoping that we can, you know, kind of keep expanding that program.
Okay. So when you studied at Berklee, Carolyn, what was your program? Was it songwriting or was it also production?
I did take some songwriting classes, but I didn't get into production at all. I'm all self-taught in the production world. But I did performance at Berklee, and then my minor was in American Roots music. I did the American Roots program.
Okay. So any important mentors from that time?
Oh my God, yes. Bruce Molsky is definitely my guy. Love Bruce. Joe Walsh, you know, dear friend and also great mentor. Daryl Anger, Matt Glazer, huge mentor of mine. And then, you know, I also, like, there were a lot of people who were like visiting artists that I really got a lot out of. And those were people in the Roots program. Casey Dreesen also, I learned a lot from him, but then I also learned a lot from Rob Thomas, who was not in the Roots program. He was teaching jazz there, but he was a huge influence on me as well.
Okay. And what did jam sessions among the students look like when you were there?
Oh my God, constant.
Hi, just a really quick break from the episode. I wanted to let you know about some other episodes. I've linked directly to this one in the show notes, with Alyssa Rose, Lily Henley, Martha Redbone, Joe K. Walsh, Alexis Chartrand, and Martin Hayes. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to sign up for my newsletter, where you'll get exclusive information about upcoming guests, a link for my Ko-fi page to support this project directly, where you can buy me one coffee or every month, and my podcast merchandise store with the design commission from artist Steffi Kelly. You can also review this podcast, share it with your friends, and follow on your podcast app, YouTube, and social media. All this helps spread the word. Thanks. Now, back to my conversation with Carolyn.
I mean, like, the first couple years when most of my cohort was in dorms, we would be like jamming in the practice rooms, jamming in our rooms, things like that. And then eventually I ended up moving to a house called the Brighton House, where like a gazillion of us lived. As a massive house. And we would have these big parties with, you know, huge jams and stuff like that. But then also, I would say probably the most important place for me in my like jamming life and learning how to play bluegrass and how to fiddle in general was at the Cantab in Boston, or in Cambridge. There was like a weekly jam on Tuesdays that I would like sneak in the back door before I turned 21, and then eventually, you know, we'd go through the front door, and that was really amazing.
So coming from this classical background as a child, but you said you played in bands and stuff in high school. I'm curious how this more ear-based learning of tunes evolved for you in improv.
Yeah, well, improv was always really important to me, as like something that I wanted to do, and like I was always very encouraged by my parents to improvise. And I always really hated classical music. I'm not gonna lie. Like I really struggled in that scene, not because I wasn't good at it. I was really good at it, but like I just culturally did not connect with the scene. Like I have come to love a lot of classical music now, but it just was not my music. It felt like it was, it felt like it was just something that I like had to do to learn how to be a technician on an instrument. But I always loved music more than anything else. But I always, my focus always, you know, in listening to music was like, I love songs and I love being able to improvise over songs. And that's really all, that's what I care about. So that's, I still feel like that's kind of my North Star rather than any like particular genre, though I am quite rooted in folk traditions. Yeah.
Well, you have such a beautiful voice.
Oh, thanks.
I was curious about your singing when you were younger. Was it choir based or what kind of singing?
Yeah, I definitely would like sing around the house quite a lot. And I took some voice lessons here and there, but I was in youth chorale, I was in youth choirs, and then eventually, like I did choir in school like a couple different years, but not the entire time. And I also did musicals growing up, so I was often, singing for that. But I always felt a lot of tension around singing really up until the last handful of years, not because I don't love singing, but I always wanted to be seen as a musician holistically. And at least when I was growing up, there was definitely like a stigma against people who were only singers, which I think is, not, I don't ascribe to that. I think that that's bullshit. But like, I was really afraid, or I didn't want to be somebody who didn't understand how harmony worked. I wanted to be somebody who improvised. I wanted to be an instrumentalist. And so I kind of like shied away from singing as an identity. Like I didn't want to be a singer. I wanted to be a musician. And there's all kinds of interesting like gendered perspectives on why that was. But I often felt like, and I still kind of feel like this, it's like I often am given vocal opportunities before I'm given instrumental opportunities, even though I do think that I'm, equally strong in both departments. But I think people tend to see men more as instrumentalists. And so, but it's really only been in the last handful of years that I felt like my singing is like a fully integrated part of my identity and my musicianship. Yeah.
And growing up with your dad being a jazz drummer, I mean, you said you're playing drums. So I imagine that's kind of intimidating, but super helpful.
Yeah, totally. And like, I loved playing, I still play drums. I have a kit right here. Yeah. I love playing drums. Playing drums is super fun. I like doing it, just as like a thing to do for fun now. But, I think I probably would have kept for a long time, drums was like my main instrument. That's like how I identified. I was like, I'm a drummer. My name's Carolyn. I'm a drummer. But then once I got into high school, the bands that I was in, I was like joining existing bands that already had drums. And I was like, I just want to be in a band. That's like my most important thing. So I'll play anything. I'll do anything you guys need. And so just kind of by nature of, circumstance, like I just ended up not playing drums quite as much and ended up going in this other pathway. Yeah.
So then what would you be doing in those bands?
I was usually singing and playing violin. Okay. Yeah. But they were usually like funk bands. So the only reason I was playing violin was because I was the only other instrument I knew how to play. and I was like, I'm not going to only be a singer, so I have to do something, Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was curious, like you released a few singles, like Break of Day, so beautiful. And you wrote that during a cross-country move?
I did, yeah. Yeah, I wrote that when I was moving from Austin to Nashville.
Okay. And, you kind of talk about struggles with perfectionism in the lyrics.
Yeah, definitely. It's so funny, too, because like I wrote that when I was 25, and like part of the lyrics is like about me turning 25. I think I wrote it like a day or two before my birthday. It's so funny that like I feel so much compassion for that version of myself, and I also feel so far away from her, and like the things that narrator is worried about is just simply not the things that I'm worried about anymore, which is like such a blessing and also so hilarious. And also I feel so deeply for that younger version of myself because she was stressed out.
Yeah, it's good to have compassion for your younger self. I think for myself, I don't often enough have. I think I'm a little bit too judgmental about my younger self. Like I should have, or
Yeah. Well, you only know what you know in the moment, but it's hard. Yeah, I understand.
The Let's talk about, because you worked for many years as a side musician, like in terms of your identity now, because you're leading your own projects. And I understand like you had an early gig, you had a duo project called the Page Turners.
I did, yes.
It's kind of a funny name. I mean, you were playing by ear, I presume, in this duo.
Yes, we were. I know, it is really funny too. Yeah, I had never even considered that aspect of it actually, because we both like became friends, and then we eventually were dating and like started this band, and like a big basis of our friendship was on our love of reading. And so that's why of reading like books, not necessarily music. So yeah. Okay.
So you have, I listened to, you have a 2020 album, Tear Things Apart. And on that you have one of my favorite folk songs, Silver Dagger. It's just really
so
powerful.
good. Yeah. I love that song so much.
Could we include a little bit of that for people, just to point people in
Yeah.
Don't sing me love songs, you'll wake my mother. She's sleeping here right by my side, and in her right hand lies a silver dagger. She says that I can't be your bride, 'cause all men are false, so says my mother. They'll tell you again, love and lies.
We've talked a little bit about your life as a singer, Carolyn, but I'm always curious to talk to singers in terms of like their voice as an instrument, kind of part of themselves but separate from themselves. How does that affect you?
Yeah, you know, I really have, I don't know why, like similarly, like I had all of these feelings as a younger person about what it would mean to be a singer, and now I feel so like lucky to be a singer, and I just love singing so much, and that was not always the case. But you know, lately, you know, I live in Los Angeles, best city in the world in my opinion, and there's like a very fun country night that I play on Tuesdays, and I've been having so much fun like approaching singing these different songs, you know, like these different George Jones songs and Buck Owens, and you know, kind of like trying to model my voice, you know, like tonally completely differently than how I would sing, you know, like my own songs or something like that. And yeah, I feel like I'm like the most agile I've ever been with my voice lately, and I feel like I've been like really enjoying working and like practicing being a vocalist in the last year or so, in a way that I think I was like maybe a little bit more begrudging about my singing before, which is I also am like sad that that's how I felt, you know.
Just curious in terms of memorizing tunes, how that works for you.
Oh my God, I used to be so bad at it. And like, I think it's kind of similar to when you learn fiddle tunes, in the sense that like the more you learn, the easier it is to learn more. And like, it used to just stress me out so much to be like, oh, I have to get like every single word correctly and have to, you know, do like, I don't know, it felt like too many chunks to bite off, or too, you know. And now I feel like I've gotten way better at being like, okay, I'm really good at remembering like the words that rhyme, and then once I remember the words that rhyme, then I remember how I feel about it, and then once you remember that, then it's a little bit easier to remember like, oh right, I'm remembering the plot line of the song rather than like individualized words. So I think that's kind of how I've at least attempted to approach it. And yeah, whenever I'm like learning a new song to sing at a gig or whatever like that, I just I often like write out the lyrics physically, not to look at, but like I actually am much worse at remembering lyrics if I have them in front of me. So yeah, like practicing remembering them like in the shower and stuff like that. That is usually how I go about it.
Yeah. Actually, that should have been a two-pronged question, because remembering lyrics is different than remembering like a fiddle tune in terms of the... I'm always curious with traditional fiddling, because as a classical player, like there's just... It seems like often the differences are a bit subtle, let me put it that way, like within a certain style of fiddling.
Yeah,
the same keys, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Lots of the same keys, lots of the same... But like it's kind of like in the same way that you remember like, you know, like when you're learning how to like drive around a city, for example, you know, at first it all seems like kind of like, oh, this is just like a blur of streets that I don't know and blah, blah, blah. But then eventually, you know, you get to be like, okay, well, I got to go to this neighborhood. I know that it's west of here. I know if I need to go west, then I need to get on the 2. And then and so you eventually like figure out these kind of like shortcuts, you know, like for example, like in a fiddle tune, there's only like 3 or 4 endings to phrases, you know, it's like da 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 or da 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 da. And so you kind of remember like the shorthands for each of how to get to each thing, as opposed to it being little individualized steps.
Yeah. Okay, the other thing I wanted to follow up with was, you said LA's the greatest city in the world.
Yeah. Which I don't expect everybody to agree with me.
I've never been there, but that wouldn't have been my impression. So tell me why you love it so much.
I absolutely adore Los Angeles. I am very Californian. I am a very Californian person, even though my extended family is very Texan. But I adore the culture here. It's such a big... I also love New York, and I love Chicago, and I love other, you know, there's lots of other places that I love, but I really love living in Los Angeles. There's so much culture. There's so much great food, so much great music. It's gorgeous. I can like walk outside and just have, you know, an infinite amount of different experiences. And I think there's like an interpretation of Los Angeles as being this like quite vapid city that maybe is like pretty image based and like image conscious. And like I do think that there are kernels of truth in that in wealthier, wider parts of Los Angeles. But I think that anybody who that's the center of their life, like that, of course, that's what you're going to think. And, you know, Los Angeles just has such a diversity of experiences and people. And if you're, you know, feeling like everybody's vapid, that might be an opportunity to like go meet other people.
Yeah, I mean, my impression actually is just like freeways, that people have to drive everywhere.
That's true. Yeah. I don't mind driving. So I think that probably would be a harder thing for if you know, if you were somebody that like bugged you. But also, you know, the part of town that I live in, like everywhere that I go, all this stuff that I do is within like a 20-25 minute like little circle. So I'm like almost never on the west side, like ever. Mm-hmm. So it's really not actually all that far or that bad.
Okay. Well, it's important to love the place we live, and you certainly moved around a bit, so you're sort of back to your roots. Yeah, definitely. It took me a long time to feel comfortable where I was living. I also really loved living in Austin. And well, I've loved a lot of things about all of the places that I've lived. But Los Angeles definitely feels like it's the most authentic place that I can feel like I'm, you know, able to can live through my values and things like that. What do you mean by live through your values? I think it's a lot easier for me to be the kind of it's easier for me here to be connected in different communities. It's easier for me to be involved with community organizing. It's easier for me to know how to interface with just any amount of if I need extended education, if I want to because I grew up in California, I feel like I understand the culture and how to navigate the systems that are in place here. I feel like I feel very comfortable with the culture generally speaking. So I'm, whereas in Nashville, I felt so out of place in terms of I'm constantly having to learn how people are, navigating
you know, like all kinds of, like, I just didn't really understand how any of the systems worked there. And I always felt a little bit like I just don't quite know how to be there. So therefore, because I'm spending all of this extra energy learning how to just get basic stuff done, that means that I don't have the energy to actually be the kind of person that I want to be, which is somebody who is, you know, like actively involved in the world around them.
Okay. Well, I'm curious in terms of, we had started talking about Don't Call Me Darlin, your new podcast project. So you had worked for other people doing different aspects of podcast world, which, you know, my podcast, I do all the things, but
yeah,
no money here. But I'm curious, what aspects do you enjoy in terms of production, writing, music, research, all that sort of thing?
I mean, I love all of it. Like, especially when it's like my project, and especially working with Tristan, who is just so brilliant and so funny. Like I really have enjoyed every bit of this process, and we similarly are running on a bit of a tight budget, so it's going to be us doing almost everything for this show. But you know, like the most meaningful thing to me thus far has been interviewing all of these women. You know, we've gotten to like go in person and interview Alice Gerrard and Laurie Lewis and just all of these heroes of mine who, you know, we're talking about music, but we're more so talking about the context of living an artistic life and how to connect and what does it mean to be a folk musician out, not just within the music that you're playing, but as like a folk community member, and like what does that mean in terms of like how you support each other and how you want your communities to grow and what you want to be different, and you know what things you want to change for the people that you love around you. And I think the interviews have really been the most meaningful to me. But also just all of, you know, doing all the sound design and making the music and all of that is really fun too.
Mm-hmm. So Alice and like these people you met, do you want to speak a little bit to who some of these people are?
We've conducted like dozens of interviews essentially with women, and they'll be kind of interstitched between our writing on this subject. But the majority of the women that we've interviewed are women that were initially featured in the newsletter in the 90s. And so there are folks who have been, you know, playing bluegrass since the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And so they're kind of like an older generation of, you know, women in bluegrass. And then we also have interviewed women who are, you know, younger and like of my generation and younger about like what it's been like to be coming up as a woman in bluegrass now that things are a little bit easier, and also kind of reflecting on like, okay, well, if being a woman in bluegrass is easier, that's great. That's certainly progress, but that does not mean that we are like necessarily, that doesn't mean we've solved all of our problems, you know, like we also don't operate on a gender binary anymore. And, you know, there are plenty of trans people in bluegrass and folk, you know, communities and things like that. And there's also like a very stark racial divide. So what are we doing about all that?
Yeah. So did you get into the racial divide?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's great to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So Carolyn, what other creative outlets do you have outside music?
Well, at the beginning of COVID, I was really like feeling estranged from my musical life. And now I feel so plugged in and dropped in with all of it. Like I, you know, have just been loving playing music and practicing and writing songs. And I'm part of this like Song a Week group with a bunch of friends of mine, and that's great. But, you know, other than that, like I love gardening. I garden all the time. I go hiking quite a lot. I do a lot of like collaging with my friends. Like last week, my friend Amy came over. She's like a poetry professor, and we made Valentines for her kids and stuff like that. But I feel like pretty lucky these days that like most of my other than, you know, the podcasts that we're making that are about music, like almost all of my creative outlets are kind of going into music these days in a way that feels good, not stressful.
Tell us about the Song of the Week Club.
Oh yeah, it's just like a group of friends of mine. Most of them live in New York. Isa's part of this group also, actually. But it's just like friends of ours who have been friends for like a really long time. And then we, write songs and then have to send them in by Friday. And then they get put into a playlist and we listen to them and give each other feedback and stuff like that. And it's all, demos of what we're working on. And
yeah.
I was working on my song for the week before we got onto the phone, and I think I'm going to have to redo the melody, but it's coming along.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you consciously use creative prompts, like if you're stuck or just for fun?
Yeah, definitely. Not always, but also part of this group is like we, each week, like whoever's song kind of felt like the most full-fledged or whatever, like somebody nominates a prompt each week within this. And so I think some ones that have come up recently, it's like write a song that feels warm, or like write a song about like the political climate in America, or write a song that is like verse refrain form. And so there's like a gazillion prompts that I fall back on constantly all the time, and a lot of them I got through, like I did take some songwriting classes at Berklee, and some of the prompts that I come back to a lot were ones that I learned from Mark Simos. And he has a really cool way of like extracting what's cool about a traditional song and then converting it into a prompt and then being able to use that as a way to kind of, jump off for your own writing.
Oh, good to know. Anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I think like the only remaining thing that I think is like maybe the thesis of not just Each Machine, but also this podcast project and Don't Call Me Darlin, and also like this upcoming record, is I just feel so lucky to be somebody who is like, I am primarily a musician. That is my main thing. Like I love being a musician. I'm a songwriter, I'm a fiddle player, I'm a producer. But I love that my life has taken this kind of unexpected route where instead of just like only being a musician, I also can like express my music through these other different creative avenues. And I think, one of the things that kind of, every classical community is different, and like but one of the things that I always kind of like was butting my head against as a kid that is eventually why I kind of left the classical community like altogether, is just because I always kind of felt like the narrower I got, the more I was celebrated. And I feel really lucky that like in this other alternative life that I've been living and that I am living, it's like the more breadth I experience, the deeper I feel, and the more connected I feel. So I feel lucky that that's the deal these days.
Well, I love that. And it's one of my inspirations for doing this podcast is that I feel that what I was shown coming up was this very tiny box, and I managed to fit into it and be successful. But there's a life in music is so broad and so diverse. So I really try to show that with this podcast and hopefully inspire listeners. There's one thing I didn't ask you about that I'm curious. Are you teaching at all?
I, there was a big period of my life where I was teaching privately quite a lot. And these days I'm mostly just teaching at fiddle camps. Okay. And that seems to be kind of like a nice balance. Like I definitely will teach like one-offs here and there to some folks, but mostly I teach at fiddle camps. I'm teaching at 3 this year. I'm teaching at 2 in California and 1 in Maine. And yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for this today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Keep in mind, I've also linked directly several episodes you'll find interesting in the show notes of this one. Please do share this with your friends and check out episodes you may have missed at leahroseman.com. If you could buy me a coffee to support this series, that would be wonderful. I'm an independent podcaster, and I really do need the help of my listeners. All the links are in the show notes. The podcast theme music was written by Nick Cold. Have a wonderful week.